They taught the warning to cadets long before they were old enough to understand it. Not as law. Not as doctrine. Not even as strategy. As a sentence. Do not take humans alive. By the time I first heard it, it had already become one of those relic phrases old officers repeated without context, like a superstition carried forward by people too cautious to throw it away and too embarrassed to explain it. It appeared in no active diplomatic handbook. It was absent from current military treaties. The trade councils never referenced it. The modern archives tagged it as obsolete language from the border conflicts, preserved for historical continuity and nothing more. Most of us assumed it belonged to a rougher age. Then the humans were taken. It happened on a Tuesday station cycle in Dock Ring 7 above the gray oceans of Harth Vale, where cargo exchanges were so routine that half the security staff stopped looking at the scans unless something caught fire. The human vessel was small, registry clean, civilian marked, and 3 hours early for its mineral transfer slot. It carried survey equipment, medical polymers, food cultures, and 11 crew members with verified passage rights. Nothing about it suggested crisis. Then the patrol ships sealed the ring. No alarm sounded at first. That was the detail I kept coming back to later. The silence. The ease of it. The confidence of officials who believed they were performing procedure, not provoking history. A customs dispute, they would later call it. A temporary detention under emergency extraction law. A matter of jurisdiction involving disputed biological cargo declarations. That was the public version. The private version moved faster. The ship's channels went dark in 8 seconds. Dock control lost exterior visual feeds 12 seconds later. By the time the first inquiry reached the lower council desks, the 11 humans had already been removed from their own vessel and transferred under armed escort to a secured holding structure 2 levels beneath the ring. Not delayed. Not quarantined. Not protected. I know because I was in Chamber Annex 3 when the first report arrived. My name is A.R. Voss, 3rd-tier diplomatic recorder, junior clerk to the Interstellar Mediation Office, assigned mostly to transcript verification, scheduling repair, and the sort of bureaucratic debris that gathers around people important enough to pretend they are too busy to read what they sign. At the time, I was 26 cycles old and exactly important enough to witness events without having the rank to shape any of them. That is how history often introduces itself. Not with trumpets. With paperwork. The alert came through as a routing mistake. A red-coded dispute summary dumped into our annex instead of central response because someone in security review had marked the species field incorrectly. I remember being annoyed before I was alarmed. I remember correcting the file tag manually. I remember reading the crew manifest because I had nothing else to do while the confirmation seal processed. 11 names. 2 engineers. 1 medic. 1 navigation specialist. A teacher returning from the colony circuit. 6 civilian crew. There was something offensive in how ordinary they looked on the record. No commandos. No diplomats. No military escorts. Just workers. I forwarded the file upward and expected the usual sequence. Protest note, jurisdiction hearing, formal delay, performative outrage, eventual compromise. That was how the council handled anything involving species from outside the inner blocks. Slow the room. Divide responsibility. Let procedure drain urgency until grief became manageable. But within 17 minutes, the first human transmission arrived. It was not addressed to the chamber. It was not marked urgent. It was not written in the heated language lesser governments use when they still believe outrage itself carries force. It was a receipt confirmation. We are aware contact has been interrupted. Stand by for direct retrieval. That was all. No accusation. No threat. No demand for explanation. Just that. I read it twice, then a third time because the wording unsettled me in a way I did not yet understand. Around me, the annex staff reacted as lesser clerks always react to calm messages from injured powers, with brief laughter. Someone said the humans were posturing. Someone else guessed they were trying to frighten the station authorities before legal review even began. My supervisor dismissed it as emotional signaling and told me to file it under pending response. But I kept staring at one word. Retrieval. Not negotiation. Not inquiry. Not appeal. Retrieval. Across the chamber wall, the station news feeds were already beginning to shape the narrative. Trade interference. Customs breach. Restricted material inspection. The captured vessel remained unnamed. The crew remained unnamed. Officials from Harth Vale spoke of temporary species management concerns and protective containment until classification is resolved. The language was polished enough to hide the crime. That, more than anything, was what made the moment dangerous. When powerful people do something unforgivable, they rarely begin with violence. They begin with vocabulary. By second cycle bell, The matter had reached the advisory council. By third bell, jurisdiction had been challenged. By fourth, 3 separate offices were arguing over whether the humans technically qualified for emergency consular review under Outer Compact standards. Committees formed. Notices were drafted. Delays thickened around the event like frost. 11 people had vanished behind state walls, and the galaxy's answer was to schedule a meeting. I should tell you now that fear did not enter the room all at once. It entered in fragments. A senior logistics officer declining to comment when asked about ring security. An encoded call from a defense liaison that went unanswered after exactly 1 sentence. A patrol commander requesting transfer off station before the request was immediately scrubbed from the internal record. And one older archivist in the corridor outside Annex 3, who heard me mention the human detention file number and stopped walking so abruptly that the data slates in his arms nearly fell. He looked at me the way people look at open airlocks. "Who authorized that?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Why?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes had gone distant, not with confusion but recognition, as if some old locked chamber in his memory had just unsealed itself. Then he said very quietly, "They actually did it." I laughed then. Nervously. Automatically. The way young officials laugh when older ones become dramatic over matters still trapped inside ordinary procedure. But he did not laugh with me. Instead, he set his slates down on the corridor bench, straightened with visible effort, and asked for the file number again. I gave it to him. He repeated it under his breath. Then he asked how many humans had been taken. 11, I said. That was when the color left his face. Not anger. Not confusion. Recognition. He whispered something I did not fully catch. I only heard the last part. Should have remained buried. Before I could stop him, he turned and walked toward the restricted archive elevators, moving with an urgency I had not seen in anyone connected to the council in all my years of service. Inside the annex, the laughter had already faded. More human messages were coming in now, routed not through diplomatic channels but through infrastructure layers no civilian delegation should have been able to access. They were not hostile. That was what made them worse. Calm requests for structural data. Calm confirmation of orbital shifts. Calm acknowledgement of local time standards. Whoever was sending them did not sound like a government pleading for hostages. They sounded like people measuring distance. By the end of the 6th bell, the chamber finally voted to convene an emergency review. Too late. Because somewhere between the first polite transmission and the last procedural objection, the old warning I had dismissed as ceremonial nonsense returned to me with the force of prophecy. Do not take humans alive. At the time, I still did not know why those words existed. I only knew one thing. Everyone in power on Hearth Vale still believed this was becoming a legal problem. They had not yet realized it had already become a historical one. By the time the emergency review began, the lie had already hardened. Not the lie that the humans were missing. That part was true. The lie was everything wrapped around it. They said the vessel had breached customs bioprotocol. They said inspectors detected undeclared organic material in one of the survey containers. They said the crew had resisted standard containment instructions. They said protective detention was necessary until species-specific contamination risks could be evaluated by the proper authorities. It was the sort of explanation bureaucracies adore. Dense enough to exhaust outrage, technical enough to confuse witnesses, moral enough to sound responsible. And almost none of it was true. The human ship had declared every cargo segment before docking. The manifest had been triple-stamped at entry buoy 6, again at orbital customs, and once more when dock ring 7 assigned it a civilian unload slot. The container now cited as biologically irregular held soil samplers, folded filtration mesh, and a children's agricultural teaching kit destined for a colony school 3 systems away. I know this because I checked. Twice. Then a third time after I convinced myself I must have missed something. There was no contamination warning. No contraband. No security breach. No resistance entry. What there was, buried in the station-side incident update beneath 6 layers of procedural tagging, was a reclassification note added 4 minutes after seizure authorization. Species flagged for discretionary containment under regional threat review. No legal citation. No signatory chain. No emergency basis. Just that sentence. Discretionary containment. I stared at it so long the letters seemed to separate from one another. That was how they had done it. Not through law but through classification. Not by proving the humans had done something wrong, but by changing what could be done to them once the right office stamped the right phrase. The system had not broken. It had behaved exactly as designed by frightened people who preferred elegant cruelty to visible violence. Around the council table, none of that mattered. By first hearing interval, The debate had already shifted away from the 11 individuals and toward process preservation. Whether outer species crews could claim immediate representative access during disputed detention. Whether station sovereignty applied in mixed commercial zones. Whether the seizure, even if premature, would be politically embarrassing to reverse before the review board had completed its work. I listened from the recorder's bench while officials discussed the timing of lunch breaks around the imprisonment of 11 civilians. That was the moment contempt entered me. Before then I had been anxious, confused, uneasy. After that I was ashamed. One of the Hearth Vale delegates, Councillor Marin Tal, argued that rapid release would reward emotional pressure tactics and encourage other peripheral governments to bypass arbitration by performing outrage. Another suggested the humans themselves bore responsibility for the escalation by transmitting retrieval language before the council had finalized its legal posture. A third, more careful than the rest, recommended a 72-hour delay to prevent the appearance of capitulation. Capitulation. The word hung in the chamber like smoke. As though returning 11 uncharged civilians to their ship would be an act of weakness. As though admitting obvious wrong required courage no government should be expected to show too quickly. No one in that room said the simple thing. They took people who were under treaty transit, sealed them away and called it management. Instead, the room produced documents, objections, clarifications, conditional amendments, sequence notes, jurisdiction maps, the machinery of civilized delay. At some point during the second interval, I requested access to the detention transfer images. My clearance was too low, but low clearance means very little in bureaucracy's drowning in confusion. Someone approved the request without checking the authorization path, and 30 seconds later the images appeared on my terminal. I wish they had not. The humans were lined against the inner cargo corridor of their own vessel, wrists restrained in front of them with field binders meant for riot suspects. 2 of them were barefoot. One older woman, ship medic according to the manifest, had blood along the left side of her neck, not severe, but visible enough to destroy any remaining illusion of protective escort. A younger crewman was half-turned toward one of the patrol officers, mouth open mid-sentence, as if he were still trying to reason with people who had already decided reasoning was unnecessary. None of them were armed. That detail should not matter, but it did. Because history becomes harder to falsify when innocence is visible. I enlarged the last frame. One of the humans was looking directly at the corridor camera. Not pleading. Not panicked. Memorizing. I did not understand then how human faces could look calm and furious at the same time. His expression unsettled me more than if he had struggled. It carried none of the disbelief the rest of us would have shown. Only recognition, as if he already knew that whatever happened next would not end inside that corridor. I closed the images and sat very still. Across the room, the hearing had entered its most insulting stage, sympathy language. Several delegates now expressed concern for the distress experienced by all sides. They spoke of tensions, misunderstandings, regrettable escalations. One even suggested the detained humans would likely be more comfortable once transferred from station security to controlled interior housing appropriate to their biological needs. I remember gripping my stylus so hard my hand cramped. The cruelty of power is often simple. The obscenity of power is often polite. At 6th interval, the first request from the human side for direct consular access was formally delayed pending review. At 7th, station command denied that any mistreatment had occurred. At 8th, someone in the press office released a statement describing the 11 detainees as temporary material witnesses in an active compliance matter. Witnesses. They had become witnesses to their own abduction. That should have broken the room. It should have forced at least one senior official to stand up and say enough. But bureaucracies rarely collapse under moral pressure. They stabilize. They redirect. They invent new shelves to place the unbearable on. By then, outer concourse feeds were full of commentary. Market analysts predicting tariff fallout. Legal scholars debating detention thresholds. Security panels explaining the necessity of calm. Very few used the word hostage. None from the central blocks. I checked the internal clock. 4 hours, 19 minutes since seizure. Then 4 hours, 20. Then 26. No release order. No access grant. No apology. Only procedure. A soft chime sounded at my console. Another message had arrived from the human side. This one was routed through standard diplomatic lanes, correctly formatted, sealed with transit authority identifiers, and written with such restraint that for a moment I mistook it for weakness. To Hearth Vale Interim Authority and Council Review Office. The detained individuals are civilian personnel under protected passage. This is your opportunity to return them safely. No further clarification is required. No threats. No anger. No rhetorical flourish. Just a statement, and beneath it, a list of 11 names. The same 11 from the manifest I had first read that morning. That, more than anything else, made my chest tighten. The humans were not arguing law. They were naming people. One by one. As if reminding the station that every hour of delay attached itself not to an abstraction, not to an incident file, but to actual lives. I looked back toward the council chamber, where Marin Tao was now speaking about precedent risk and species leverage, and I understood with sudden, sick clarity that everyone important on Hearth Vale had made the same mistake. They thought this was still about authority. They thought the humans would bargain because all governments bargain eventually. That they would threaten, posture, invoke law, seek allies, and try to preserve face the way civilized powers always do when cornered in public. They had not understood the meaning of the first message. Stand by for direct retrieval. Not diplomacy. Not negotiation. A timeline. At 5 hours, 3 minutes after the seizure, one of the detention wardens filed a quiet request for reinforced corridor locks around sublevel 12. The request cited no incident, but it included an attachment listing power redundancies, blast door timings, and internal guard rotation patterns. I should not have seen it. Somehow it reached me anyway, misrouted through annex systems already buckling under the volume of unauthorized traffic. It was signed, then unsent, then resubmitted from a different terminal. Fear was starting to move inside the station. Not public fear. Not yet. Professional fear. The kind that begins when the people closest to an injustice realize they may be the ones standing nearest to its consequences. I forwarded the warden's request to my supervisor. He told me to ignore it. I did not. Instead, I opened the file on the old warning phrase again, the one the archivist had reacted to in the corridor. There was almost nothing in the active database. No usable doctrine. No case notes. No current statutes. Just a dead cross-reference pointing toward a restricted historical article whose title had been partially sealed. Article 0, Human Containment Events. Containment Events. Even then, even in the middle of everything, the phrase made no sense to me. It sounded too clinical, too ancient, too carefully named. But below the title there was a line of archival metadata, one that had survived whatever later governments had tried to bury. Classification retained by unanimous vote. Public citation discouraged. Reason, recurrence risk. Recurrence. I read that word, and for the first time all day I stopped feeling confused. Because recurrence means pattern. And pattern means this had happened before. Somewhere behind me, in the council chamber, another motion to delay release was being introduced. Some official was still speaking about process. Still speaking about optics. Still speaking as though time belonged to the station. But the truth had changed. This was no longer a detention waiting to be resolved. It was a test already being failed. And on Hearth Vale, surrounded by committees, cameras, uniforms, signatures, and the polished manners of people certain they controlled the pace of history, 11 ordinary humans were still locked below the ring while powerful men argued over what to call the crime. I was not important enough to enter the room where the real decisions were made. That is not false modesty. It is administrative fact. On Hearth Vale, importance was measured in doors that opened when you approached them and in how many people stopped speaking when you entered. By that standard, I ranked somewhere below useful equipment and slightly above decorative plants. I had no voice in emergency motions. No authority to challenge a council suspension. No military access. No protected channel to the species delegates. I recorded statements, corrected timestamps, cross-linked hearing transcripts, and made sure powerful people could later deny things in clean, searchable language. Which is why, when the station began to tilt toward panic, no one noticed me moving through it. I remained what I had always been. Background. The council chamber grew louder as the hours passed, but not in the way outsiders imagine. There was no shouting, no dramatic denunciation, no visible cracking under pressure. Real institutions almost never sound dramatic while they are failing. They sound measured, offended, busy. They generate more language as if quantity itself can serve as control. I left the annex under pretense of retrieving a signature slate from mediation records and began walking the inner corridors with my recorder badge visible and my head lowered, the universal posture of a functionary too dull to obstruct. It worked because people in crisis stop seeing clerks. They speak around them, over them, through them. And so I heard things I was never meant to hear. Outside security coordination, 2 patrol supervisors stood in front of a sealed door pretending they were discussing shift allocations. They sent how many? One asked. Unconfirmed. That means they know. They knew before the seizure was logged. Silence. Then the first one said in a voice suddenly thinner than before, "We should release them." The second looked down the corridor, saw me and stopped talking. I kept walking. At Logistics Junction 4, 3 cargo officers were arguing over docking priority requests from ships that technically did not exist. No transponder flags. No declared governments. No cargo declarations. Just inbound mass signatures holding outside standard trade lanes and refusing all routine station traffic. Merchant escorts don't stack like that, one officer muttered. They aren't merchant escorts. Then what are they? No one answered. In the lower archive hall, I found the old archivist again. He was standing alone at a dead terminal, one hand flat against the screen as if willing it to open faster. He looked older now than he had only hours before. Not physically older, stripped older. As if some layer of professional calm had been cut away and beneath it there was only memory. You found it, I said. He did not turn. I found pieces. What is Article 0? That finally made him look at me. I had expected reluctance. Irritation. Perhaps a lecture on clearance. What I saw instead was calculation. Not whether I should know, but whether I was already too close to remain ignorant. What office are you attached to? He asked. Mediation Annex 3. Then you've read the detention file. Yes. And the messages? Yes. His jaw tightened. Then listen carefully, he said. If the station still has anyone in authority capable of ending this, they must do it now. That isn't an answer. No, he said. It's more useful than one. He pulled a slate from the terminal housing and handed it to me. Most of the screen was blacked out by restriction fields. Only a few metadata lines remained visible. Article 0, Human Containment Events Original Adoption. Post-Avon Settlement Review Access Limited by Joint Civilizational Compact Summary Language Prohibited in Public Instruction Standing Caution Retained. Below that, in a section so heavily damaged only fragments survived, there were 5 readable words. Do not separate them from. And farther down. Response escalation not proportional. And then, at the bottom. Recovery priority absolute. I looked up. This can't be real. The archivist gave a tired, joyless laugh. That is what every generation says. Who were the Davin? For a moment I thought he would answer. Instead he took the slate back from me and slid it into his coat. A species that believed distance was protection, he said. Go back to your annex, Recorder Voss. That's all? That is already too much. He moved away before I could stop him, disappearing into the corridor shadows with the hurried gait of someone who knew knowledge itself could become dangerous if held too openly. I should have returned to the annex. Instead I went lower. The sublevels beneath the council ring were not forbidden to me, only inconvenient. They were built for maintenance crews, storage processors, environmental systems, and detention transfers the upper stations preferred not to think about. The air smelled different there, colder, metal-heavy, recirculated too many times. Official architecture grows more honest the farther it descends. At sublevel 9, security presence tripled. Not visible alertness. Controlled alertness. Officers stood in pairs instead of alone. Doors remained open that were usually shut, and shut that were usually open. Internal drones moved in silent loops near ceiling rails. No alarm lights flashed, but the corridor rhythm was wrong. Everyone walking there was pretending the station had not changed. That is one of the ways fear announces itself. Not by shouting danger. By overperforming normal. A detention officer emerged from a side passage carrying a half-empty case of restraint fields. He nearly collided with me, muttered an apology, then froze when he read my badge. Mediation? He asked. Yes. Why are you here? Transfer verification, I lied. His face twitched. Not because he believed me but because the lie was so weak it confirmed something worse. His gaze moved once toward the lower sealed doors then back to me. You should leave, he said. Why? This time he did not hide the answer quickly enough. Because if they come through here, badges won't matter. He walked away before I could ask who he meant. I stood motionless in the corridor, listening to the mechanical hum beyond the blast partition. Somewhere below, beneath layers of steel, force fields, and official language, 11 humans were still being held while the station built thicker walls around itself and pretended that thicker walls were the same thing as safety. My terminal vibrated. A system-wide advisory had just gone out to all upper administrative personnel. Maintain current assignments. Avoid unsanctioned movement between security levels. Do not engage in species-related speculation. A coordinated response is in progress. That phrase again. A coordinated response. Not the response. A response. The sort of wording institutions use when they no longer know whether they are describing their own actions or someone else's. I returned to the annex shortly before dusk cycle, and for the first time that day no one told me where to sit. People were too busy reading screens. The laughter from the morning was gone. In its place was the quiet of offices beginning to understand that procedure might not be strong enough to contain consequence. My supervisor kept refreshing a live transport board that now showed 17 arrival requests in outer orbit, 9 denied for unanswered, and the rest marked pending under defense override. Another clerk whispered that station defense had requested tactical consultation from the inner moons. Another said the moons had declined to commit. Another claimed 3 patrol commanders were no longer responding on secure channels. No one knew what was true. That was the other way panic entered institutions. First, too much confidence. Then too many versions. A fresh human message arrived at 1914 station cycle. It was addressed only to interim authority, but annex routing protocols copied it into our queue before anyone could suppress it. To those currently delaying release, you are misidentifying the nature of this moment. Return our people. That was all. The first line hit the room harder than any threat could have. Because threats leave room for bargaining. Correction leaves room only for shame. Across from me, Clerk Saren swallowed audibly and said, "Why do they write like that?" No one answered him. I knew the answer, though I could not yet prove it. Because they were not trying to convince us. They were documenting us. Every message from the human side felt less like pressure and more like record building, as though the real audience for their words was not the council but history. As though somewhere beyond the station, decisions had already been made and these transmissions existed only to mark the final chances offered before action. That realization made me colder than fear. Made me feel late. At 2002, Councillor Marintal formally recommended extending the detention review to full-cycle legal examination. At 2011, the motion received provisional support from 3 bloc representatives. At 2016, a station-side press packet was drafted describing the 11 humans as protected persons under containment review. At 2018, a defense liaison requested updated schematics for all sub-level approach corridors and was denied by station authority. At 2021, the request was granted anyway by someone above station authority whose name had been redacted before the file finished loading. I read that line twice. Granted anyway. The room around me seemed to tilt. Someone above station authority had intervened. Not publicly. Not enough to stop the council. But enough to reach into its sealed systems and pull something loose. That was when I understood what my role had become. Not actor. Not rescuer. Witness. And witnesses, if they are fortunate and careful, sometimes get to see the exact second a lie begins to realize it is mortal. I opened every file I had copied that day and built a private sequence on my terminal. Seizure log, manifest, detention images, human messages, Article 0 metadata, sublevel lock requests, defense override grants. Looking at them together changed their meaning. Individually they were fragments. Together they formed the outline of an event too large for any one office to admit. 11 civilians taken. Immediate calm response from Earth. Restricted historical warning suppressed from public use. Security fear rising below the official level of acknowledgement. Unmarked arrivals outside station lanes. Defense overrides beginning to bypass civilian authority. Pattern. Recurrence. The word from the archive returned to me again. Not because history was repeating exactly. Because someone, somewhere, had prepared for the possibility that it might. At 2034, the outer hull cameras lost track of 3 inbound signatures for exactly 11 seconds. When the feed restored, the signatures had reappeared inside the station's exclusion shadow, where no ship should have been able to maneuver without full guidance approval. No explanation followed. No public note. Only a quiet flood of access denials across the security net as systems began closing themselves faster than commands could be issued. Beside me, my supervisor went pale. "What is that?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just backed away from his console as if distance from information could still be useful. And in that moment, watching frightened officials retreat from screens they had trusted all their lives, I finally understood why this story had needed someone like me to tell it. Because power does not describe its own humiliation honestly. It softens. It edits. It hides behind sequence language and committee phrasing and missing timestamps. Only the powerless remember what the room felt like before the myth began. Only the clerk remembers who laughed in the morning. Only the witness notices when that laughter dies. By then, Hearth Vale was no longer deciding what to do. It was discovering, second by second, that its decisions were already becoming irrelevant. An IAR Voss, junior recorder, annex clerk, professional background object, could do nothing except watch the shape of the coming answer gather around the station like a closing hand. The archive did not open because I had permission. It opened because too many frightened people had started touching the same locked doors at once. There is a weakness in every bureaucracy, though most institutions would rather die than admit it. When panic rises high enough, Clearance becomes a traffic problem. Files move. Requests collide. Security branches override one another. Temporary access tokens are generated, duplicated, revoked, then regenerated by systems no longer certain which level of authority still applies. The machinery that usually protects secrets begins, under pressure, to expose them. That was how Article 0 reached me. Not through courage. Not through trust. Not even through rebellion. Through administrative confusion. At 2047 station cycle, a restricted archive packet appeared in my private terminal queue under emergency cross-reference review, tagged for council historical advisory and misrouted through mediation records because someone, somewhere, had used an obsolete classification chain no longer recognized by half the station's active systems. The sender field was blank. The clearance path was broken. The document existed for exactly 11 seconds before auto-restriction protocols tried to pull it back. I copied it in 6. Then I disconnected my terminal from the annex grid and sat very still, listening to my own breathing. Across the room no one noticed. That was the strange thing about the beginning of historic moments. You always imagine they will arrive with obvious music, obvious light, obvious recognition. Instead, most of them arrive while someone nearby is still complaining about authorization lag or asking whether the chamber recess has been extended by another 12 minutes. The file opened as damaged text. No images. No insignia. No author name. Just an old compact header, older than the current council by centuries, stamped with a designation I had never seen outside intercivilizational treaty relics. Joint Continuity Preservation Accord Restricted Historical Hazard Record Article 0. Human Containment Events. Beneath it, a note in smaller text. Public discussion discouraged except under direct recurrence conditions. This article exists to prevent miscalculation. I read that line once, then again. Not to punish. Not to condemn. To prevent miscalculation. That was the first sign the file was not written like law. It was written like warning. The beginning contained only fragments, preservation damage chewing through entire sections of meaning, but enough remained to tell me what kind of thing I was holding. Article 0 had not been a military directive. It had not even started as a formal doctrine. It had begun, according to the surviving text, as a post-crisis summary compiled after containment assumptions concerning emergent human populations produced systemic escalation across multiple theaters. The wording was clinical. The implication was not. I scrolled farther. More gaps. More blacked-out sections. More missing centuries. Then the first intact paragraph appeared. Human territorial behavior, while measurable, is not the primary catalyst in containment escalation. Human response is most reliably activated by involuntary separation from identified persons under their protection, care, command, kinship, treaty bond, or proximity-assigned responsibility. Analysts repeatedly erred by treating human recovery attempts as symbolic or negotiable. They are neither. I stopped reading. Not because I wanted to, but because my body had gone cold enough that I could no longer feel my fingers against the slate. Not symbolic. Not negotiable. The station around me seemed to retreat several steps from my awareness. Noise dulled. Voices blurred. Only the words remained. I forced myself onward. In all reviewed incidents, initial detaining authorities assumed human governments would pursue recognizable strategic incentives. Territory exchange, prisoner trade, prestige preservation, material concession, ceasefire leverage, or controlled diplomatic escalation. These assumptions were invalid. Once a recovery threshold is crossed, human action reorients away from gain and toward completion. Completion. I read the word 4 times. There are some words that look harmless until the sentence around them reveals their true shape. Completion was one of those words. It did not mean attack. It did not mean retaliation. It did not even mean victory. It meant finish. Not a performance of strength. Not a bargain. An ending. A tremor passed through the annex floor beneath my feet, not violent enough to trigger alarms, but deep enough that every loose stylus on every desk shivered in place for an instant before settling again. No one spoke. A second later, the wall screens flickered and restored. Somewhere inside the station, systems were being touched in ways they had not expected. I went back to the file. The next surviving section had been preserved more clearly, perhaps because someone long ago had understood it mattered more than the rest. The critical error of prior powers was scale misidentification. Human recovery behavior does not remain limited to the size of the initial offense. The offended unit may be one person, one vessel, one outpost, or one family group. The responding human system rapidly expands moral scope until all structures associated with the separation are treated as relevant. This is not rage in the conventional sense. It is recursive obligation. Recursive obligation. I whispered the phrase aloud without meaning to. One of the other clerks glanced toward me, then away again. Recursive obligation. The file was giving names to something the council chamber still believed was a political dispute. Not aggression. Not wounded national pride. Obligation. Expanding obligation. A moral geometry that widened until every wall between the taken and the returned became part of the problem to be solved. Suddenly the earlier human messages made perfect sense. Stand by for direct retrieval. You are misidentifying the nature of this moment. Return our people. There had been no negotiation because, from their perspective, there was nothing to negotiate. Only obstruction or release. My hands were moving faster now, scrolling through old damaged scars and compact annotations. Someone, many someones over many years, had fought to keep the article alive while stripping away everything that might make it common knowledge. Paragraphs vanished midline. Entire case references had been converted to blank fields. Species names were removed. Locations erased. Dates rounded into protected era markers. But the cautionary core remained intact with almost stubborn persistence. Then I found the line the archivist must have seen earlier. Do not separate humans from those they have accepted as theirs and expect proportion to remain available to you. It was not elegant. It was not ceremonial. It was not myth. It was worse. It was the kind of sentence written by survivors. The annex had grown so quiet by then that I could hear individual breathing again. Someone on the far side of the room was trying and failing to connect to internal defense feeds. My supervisor had stopped pretending to work and was now simply watching the security bulletin channel refresh itself every few seconds like a man waiting to see whether his future still existed. I scrolled farther down. The next preserved block was labeled Historical Recurrence Summary, Authorized Eyes Only. And beneath it, a bulleted list so heavily reduced by preservation protocols that each entry read like the tombstone of an argument. Case 01, Border Appropriation of Juvenile Group, Total Settlement Evacuation. Case 04, Treaty Hostage Doctrine Against Expeditionary King Unit, Naval Collapse Across 3 Regions. Case 09, Labor Seizure Framed as Administrative Retention, Governing Exchange Removed Within 13 Days. Case 12, Civilian Relocation to Induce Compliance, Species Compact Rewritten Post-Conflict. Case 14, Containment of Medical Convoy Personnel, Archival Redaction Order Initiated. I stared at the list until my eyes hurt. Not because it was graphic. It wasn't. Because it was repetitive. Same mistake. Again and again. Different powers, different eras, different excuses, different bureaucratic language, but always the same miscalculation beneath it. Someone took humans or those under human protection and expected the response to remain normal. No wonder public citation had been discouraged. This was not just history. It was embarrassment. Civilizational embarrassment, old enough to become taboo. A new notice flashed across my disconnected terminal, buffered before the annex network fully severed. Sublevel 12 access failure. Manual override rejected. Cause, unresolved. Then another. Internal transit routes 4, 6, and 9 temporarily unavailable. Cause, pending verification. Then another, from a defense node so deep in the station hierarchy I should never have been able to see it. All units maintain current position. Do not pursue without direct command authorization. Without direct command authorization. Meaning someone already feared pursuit. I returned to the article and found the final intact section. It was short. Far shorter than I expected after all the build-up. Just 3 preserved paragraphs under the heading. Standing guidance. 1. If separation has occurred, reverse it immediately. 2. Do not assume delay reduces response likelihood. Delay increases response scope. 3. Do not rely on symbolic concessions once human recovery systems are active. Return the taken. Return them intact. Return them fast. That was it. No weapons guidance. No strategic diagrams. No defense instructions. Because whoever wrote Article 0 had understood a brutal truth. By the time anyone needed battlefield advice, the useful part of the warning had already passed. The only winning action had always been earlier. I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. Tried to fit the article into the day I had lived so far. 11 civilians seized. Council delays release. Humans issue calm notices. Sublevels begin locking in irregular patterns. Defense channels go strange. Article 0 emerges from burial to say, in essence, that every minute of delay was transforming the event into something wider, harder, and less survivable. I should have felt vindicated. Instead I felt horror. Because once you understand that a disaster is patterned, you also understand how likely it is to continue. The archivist was right. This should have remained buried, if only because any society forced to unbury it had probably already waited too long. A soft sound came from the annex entrance. I looked up. The old archivist stood there, one hand against the frame, breathing hard as if he had climbed stairs faster than his body approved of. His eyes went immediately to my disconnected terminal, then to my face. "You accessed it," he said. I did not deny it. He crossed the room in quick, uneven steps and lowered his voice. "Tell me exactly what you saw." I summarized the surviving lines as quickly as I could. The catalytic trigger. The recursive obligation. The recurrence list. The standing guidance. As I spoke, his face tightened with each phrase, not because he was surprised, but because hearing it aloud made the situation more real. When I finished, he closed his eyes for a moment. "They delayed too long," I said. "Yes." "What were the Davin?" This time he answered. "The last major power to think custody was leverage." The words hit harder than any grand explanation could have. "What happened to them?" He looked toward the chamber wall as though he could see through steel, stone, procedure, and time itself. "What always happens to people who confuse possession with control," he said. Before I could ask anything more, every screen in the annex went black. Not darkened. Not disconnected. Black. For one suspended second, the entire room was reflected back at itself in dead glass. Clerks half risen from their chairs, my supervisor frozen with one hand still on his terminal, the archivist beside me like a man standing at the edge of a remembered cliff. Then the station-wide public channel returned. Not with alarms. With a single line of text, white on black. "External communication from Earth acknowledged. Direct retrieval is in progress." No seal. No flourish. No explanation. Across the annex, someone made a small involuntary sound I had never before heard from an adult professional. Not a cry. Not a word. The sound of certainty breaking. The archivist opened his eyes and whispered, almost to himself. "They told us." No one answered him. Because now, at last, everyone understood the same thing. The old warning had not been about human anger. It had been about human follow-through. And somewhere below us, behind doors the station had trusted too much. 11 ordinary civilians were waiting while a buried article from a disgraced age unfolded itself into the present. The Davin were not monsters. That, perhaps, was the most frightening part. If they had been cruel in the theatrical way lesser histories prefer, if they had been butchers, zealots, slavers with banners made from bones, then what followed might have been easier to explain. Easier to place at a safe distance. Easier to call justice and leave buried beneath the old comforting categories of deserved ruin. But the surviving records did not describe monsters. They described a civilization of systems. Disciplined. Expansionist. Brilliant. Administratively obsessed. The kind of power that measures worlds before it conquers them and writes laws before it fires. The Davin did not think of themselves as brutal. They thought of themselves as corrective. They entered unstable regions, imposed order, reorganized transit, standardized trade, relocated populations they considered strategically inconvenient, and called the entire process stewardship. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of people who would believe custody was not violence if the paperwork was elegant enough. The archivist and I stood in the dead light of the annex screens while the public channel kept repeating the same line. Direct retrieval is in progress. No one in the room seemed willing to move beneath it. No one except the archivist, who lowered himself into the chair beside my terminal with the slow care of someone whose body had long ago learned the cost of remembering too much. "You asked what happened to the Davin," he said. "Yes. You won't find the truth in ordinary archives." "Then where?" He gave a thin, exhausted smile. "In the places people hide what they are ashamed to have survived." He took a breath, as if deciding how much of an old wound to reopen. The Davin hegemony controlled 31 recognized systems at its height. 43 if you count the protectorates they refused to call colonies. They were not the largest military power of their age, but they were one of the most efficient. Their fleets moved on schedule. Their governance was layered, documented, predictable. They did not wage chaotic wars. They imposed solutions. The phrasing was familiar enough to make my stomach tighten. Hearthvale also believed in solutions. What did they do to the humans? His gaze drifted for a moment, not away from me but away from now. At first, the same thing everyone always does when they encounter a young species they mistake for manageable. They underestimated context. That was not an answer, but I had already learned older men sometimes approached the truth sideways when the direct path hurt too much. The humans at that time, he continued, were not what they are now. Not politically. Not technologically. Their worlds were divided. Their fleets were small. Their colonies were fragile. They argued with one another constantly. From the Davin perspective, they looked disorganized, emotionally noisy, and strategically immature. Weak. Yes, he said. Weak enough to be instructed. He said the last word with such open disgust that I felt a chill crawl up my back. The room around us remained frozen in half-function. Terminals blinking back to life. Security feeds flickering in and out. Quiet officials trying not to look at one another. The council chamber doors still sealed, though no one now believed the chamber controlled anything that mattered. What did instruction mean? I asked. The archivist folded his hands. It meant pressure, then leverage, then an incident. Always an incident. The galaxy does not begin disasters with declarations. It begins them with incidents, small enough to excuse, procedural enough to defend, local enough to contain. The word itself is a laundering tool. It takes the sharp edge off choice and gives it the shape of accident. The Davin wanted transit concessions through a human-aligned corridor, the archivist said. There were disputes, delays, failed talks. The human governments involved were fractured and inconsistent. Some cooperated. Some resisted. The Davin believed the easiest path to compliance was not invasion. He paused. They took 13. The number landed in me like a dropped weight. 13 what? Not soldiers. Not heads of state. Family members. Children of delegates. Siblings. 2 medical volunteers attached to a treaty team. 1 navigation trainee who had been in the wrong shuttle at the wrong time. They called it temporary protective custody until corridor stability could be restored. The annex air suddenly felt thinner. Even now, with centuries between us, I could hear the structure of the lie. Protective. Temporary. Stability. The same polished language, merely wearing older clothes. They thought it was clever, the archivist said. That was the heart of it. They believed they had discovered the perfect middle ground between negotiation and force. No bombardment. No open war. No mass casualties. Just controlled detention of a strategically meaningful group to compel reasonable behavior. Did the humans negotiate? He looked at me for a long second, and in his eyes I saw not suspense, but the tired pity reserved for questions every generation insists on asking as though it might finally produce a different answer. They tried to get the 13 back. Tried how? At first? Like everyone else. Messages. Appeals. Emergency envoys. Trade suspension threats. Corridor withdrawals. Public petitions. The Davin read all of it correctly and understood none of it. Because they thought the process was the event. Because they believed what powerful systems always believe, that if a thing is still inside language, then language still owns it. The archivist continued. The Davin mistook early diplomacy for the full human response. They saw distress and called it weakness. They saw division among the human governments and called it incapacity. They saw moral language and assumed it was theater. Their analysts concluded the detainees had too much symbolic value to be harmed and therefore too much symbolic value for the humans to risk escalation. Symbolic value. There it was again. The old mistake. People who do not understand attachment always assume others use loved ones the way states use flags, as leverage objects, painful but negotiable. What happened instead? I asked. The archivist leaned back and stared up at the black ceiling panels. The humans stopped arguing with one another. It was such a simple sentence that at first I failed to grasp its enormity. Not because unity is rare. Because it is expensive. Species do not become terrifying when they are strongest. They become terrifying when internal friction fails. The surviving military studies, he said, suggest that was the real point of no return. Not the seizure itself. Not even the detention sites. The moment the Davin transformed scattered human interests into a single obligation. 13 taken individuals. Thousands of divided arguments instantly collapsed into one purpose. He turned back toward me. That was the first thing Article 0 was trying to teach. You do not need to threaten all humans to activate them. You only need to force enough of them to agree on what matters. And nothing makes agreement faster than the taking of one's own. The room lights dimmed briefly. Somewhere far below us, the station structure pulsed again with a vibration too deep to be accidental. This time no one pretended not to notice. Across the annex, Clerk Saren whispered a prayer in a language I did not know. My supervisor did not correct him. What did the humans do? I asked. The archivist's mouth tightened. They recovered the 13. The answer was so restrained it almost felt cruel. How? He gave me the kind of look teachers reserve for students who have not yet understood the shape of the lesson. That is the wrong question. Then what is the right one? How much disappeared because the Davin assumed recovery would stay local? I said nothing. Because suddenly I knew what was coming and still I needed to hear it. The first detention facility lost contact 7 hours after the last humanitarian appeal expired, he said. The Davin believed it was sabotage. The second site suffered reactor interruption 12 hours later. Then a fleet tender vanished in transit with all command staff aboard. Then corridor relays began failing. Then local collaborators started disappearing. Then judicial archives. Then logistics depots. Then the officers responsible for transfer authorizations. Then the committee that had designed the custody doctrine. He was not speaking quickly. He was speaking carefully. As though speed might cheapen the memory of what method can do. It was not a war in the form that Davin recognized, he continued. That was their second mistake. They kept waiting for decisive engagement. Fleet concentration. Territory seizure. Formal retaliation. They wanted a battlefield because battlefields preserve proportion. Instead they got something narrower and far worse. Recovery, I said. He nodded. Every person, institution, vessel, route, archive, command chain, supply node, and political mechanism standing between the 13 and their return became relevant. Not always destroyed. Not always attacked. But made unable to continue existing in its prior form. The phrase from Article 0 came back to me with perfect clarity. Human action reorients away from gain and toward completion. The annex felt colder with every second. The 13 survived? I asked. 12 did. I closed my eyes. Not because I could not bear the number. Because I suddenly understood why the article had sounded the way it did. The people who wrote warnings like that were never writing for the dead. They were writing for the people who still had time not to join them. What happened to the Davin after? I asked quietly. The archivist exhaled through his nose. They won several battles. I stared at him. They what? They won battles, he repeated. Tactical encounters. Fleet actions. Border holds. Interdiction runs. Their admirals remained competent. Their ships remained dangerous. Their territory remained vast. That was why the catastrophe confused later historians for so long. On paper, the Davin did not collapse all at once. But they disappeared. Yes, he said. Because the humans were not trying to defeat them in the way the Davin understood defeat. That was the line that finally opened the full shape of the horror. Not conquest. Not revenge. Not imperial replacement. Something else. The Davin lost continuity, the archivist said. That was the formal term in the sealed review. Governance broke sequence. Supply certainty vanished. Internal trust dissolved. Peripheral protectorates defected. Transit insurance markets failed. Allied species withdrew legal recognition. 3 subordinate client worlds revolted once they realized the hegemony could no longer guarantee retrieval or protection even for its own administrators. A power can survive lost ships. It can survive lost battles. Sometimes it can survive lost worlds. He looked directly at me. It cannot survive becoming unbelievable. The sentence hit with the quiet force of truth that had waited centuries for someone to say it simply. The humans had not needed to burn the Davin out of the stars. They had only needed to make the Davin unable to function as the thing they had been. What did the sealed review conclude? I asked. His answer came without hesitation. That the initial custody event had been strategically minor and civilization ally fatal. I repeated the phrase under my breath. Strategically minor. Civilization ally fatal. 11 humans on Hearth Vale. A minor station by galactic standards. A commercial ring above gray water. A paperwork crime defended by committees. My throat went dry. The archivist saw the thought land in me. Yes, he said softly. Now you understand the problem. I looked at the public channel still displaying its terrible calm. Direct retrieval is in progress. No threats. No declarations. Because threats are for people seeking leverage. This was something else. What happened to the one who died? I asked. The archivist's face altered, not much but enough. A line deepened beside his mouth. His eyes lost focus for a moment, not from age but memory. Their name was Litomar, he said. Junior medic. 19 standard years. Taken during the second transfer. Died before the others were reached. 19. One dead among 13. And an empire had spent the next generation discovering the real cost of that arithmetic. What did the humans do after they recovered the survivors? The archivist answered with a bitterness so old it had become almost ceremonial. They stopped. I frowned. That's impossible. No, he said. That is the part no one ever believes until it is too late. He leaned toward me slightly. The humans did what was necessary to recover the 12 who still lived, to account for the one who did not, and to dismantle every active structure that could continue or repeat the separation. And then they stopped. They did not occupy Davin core worlds. They did not rewrite the stars in their own image. They did not hunt for sport. They ended the capacity behind the act and then withdrew. That should have made them less frightening. Instead it made them more so. Because indiscriminate violence can be understood as madness. Precision requires memory. They weren't raging, I whispered. No, said the archivist. They were finishing. The station around us groaned again, louder now. Somewhere below the annex, automated locks slammed in rapid sequence. One, then another, then 5 more like metallic thunder traveling sideways through the bones of Hearth Vale. A security bulletin flashed and vanished before the public screens could fully display it. In the chamber beyond the sealed council doors, someone began shouting at last. Too late. Far too late. I looked back at the broken article on my terminal, then at the old man beside me, then at the roomful of officials who still wanted this to be a policy failure instead of what it had become. The Davin had not been monsters. They had been sure. Sure of law. Sure of structure. Sure of distance. Sure that 13 people could be held inside procedure without waking anything larger than protest. And because they were sure, they had taught the galaxy a lesson so humiliating that later civilizations buried it instead of learning it properly. Do not mistake human attachment for symbolism. Do not confuse calm with passivity. Do not assume recovery remains proportional once delayed. Do not believe victory in battle matters if continuity itself begins to fail. And above all, do not take what humans have accepted as theirs and expect the universe to stay arranged for your convenience. The archivist rose slowly from his chair. There's one more thing the public versions never say, he murmured. What? He looked toward the floor, toward the sublevels where the 11 detainees still waited. The Davin's final internal broadcast before continuity collapse. You know it? Only one line survived and censored. I felt my pulse in my throat. What was it? His voice was almost gentle. We thought they wanted revenge. They only wanted them back. For a moment, no one in the annex breathed. Then every screen in the room changed at once. The public channel vanished. The chamber feed vanished. The station crest vanished. In their place appeared a plain black field and a single system notice stamped across it in white. Sublevel 12 containment integrity lost. And beneath that a second line followed. Internal response team stand down. The archivist closed his eyes. Not in surprise. In recognition. The old precedent was no longer history. It had become instruction. And somewhere below us, behind the last doors Hearth Vale still trusted, the galaxy was about to relearn why Article 0 had survived every attempt to bury it. No one moved when the notice appeared. That was the first thing I remember. Not panic. Not shouting. Not the immediate stampede lesser stations would have produced the moment a detention block reported integrity failure. Just stillness. The kind that enters a room when everyone inside it realizes, all at once, that the future has separated from the plans they were still making. Across the annex, Clerk Saren's mouth was slightly open. My supervisor had one hand braced against his terminal as if the furniture itself might still anchor him to a version of the station where titles, protocols, and committee motions mattered. Through the sealed doors beyond the chamber wall, raised voices collided in uneven bursts. Some still demanding reports, some demanding names, some demanding command authority no longer seemed to answer to them. On every public screen the same 2 lines remained. Sublevel 12 containment integrity lost. Internal response teams stand down. The second line was worse. Because systems do not tell armed personnel to stand down unless one of 2 things has happened. Either the threat below is too dangerous to engage, or someone above them has decided engagement would make it worse. I do not know which possibility unsettled the room more. The archivist opened his eyes and spoke without turning toward me. They're still being given a chance. The sentence sounded absurd in that moment. A detention block had failed. Station control was fragmenting. Internal authority chains were visibly buckling. Somewhere beneath us, whatever everyone had feared all day was no longer approaching. It had already entered. And yet the old man said chance, not doom. Then my terminal chimed. Not through station routing. Not through the annex queue. Directly. The screen flickered once, rejected 2 local security hooks, and opened a plain text window without crest or diplomatic formatting. No sender name. No delegation seal. No encryption watermark visible to civilian recorders. Just a line of text centered in the middle of the screen like something already decided. We are on site. Release corridor maps. Do not interfere. I read it once, then twice, then aloud before I realized I was doing it. The annex went stiller somehow, which I had not thought possible. Clerk Saren looked at me as if I had just recited an execution order. My supervisor took 1 step toward my desk, then stopped halfway, either because he feared the message itself or because, for the first time in his life, he did not know whether being senior still meant being safer. You received that? He asked. I nodded. Why you? Because I had the detention file. Because I had touched the archive. because I was one of the few still reading events instead of defending them. But before I could shape any answer, the message vanished and was replaced by a second one. Shorter. Colder. You still think this is pending. No threat. No rage. No decoration. Just correction. The word struck harder than accusation because accusation implies argument, and argument implies room to persuade. But persuasion was gone now. The message did not ask. It did not challenge. It diagnosed. You are behind reality. You are still naming what has already been decided elsewhere. I looked toward the chamber doors. Inside, the council was no doubt still trying to determine who had jurisdiction over a crisis that was moving faster than law. Somewhere, Councillor Marental was probably still demanding command briefings. Somewhere, station authority was probably still drafting a statement about unlawful intrusion, temporary communications failure, regrettable misunderstanding. But the humans had just told us the real truth of the hour. The station was not managing an emergency. It was lagging behind an outcome. Then every annex terminal flashed simultaneously with a security cascade I had never seen before. Transit routes 4, 6, 9 locked sublevel camera array degraded field suppressors offline manual override unavailable cause. Unauthorized sequence conflict. Unauthorized sequence conflict. It was the kind of phrase systems invent when the real explanation would sound too much like defeat. The floor trembled again. Harder this time. Hard enough to send 3 stacked data slates clattering from a side desk. Somewhere below us, metal met metal in a rolling shock that carried through the station ribs like distant thunder trapped inside machinery. One of the clerks gasped. Another began crying quietly without seeming to notice she was doing it. Still no alarms. That was what made the whole thing unreal. Hearth Vale was built by people who believed in warnings. Every corridor had sirens. Every sublevel had breach tones. Every dock ring had evacuation guidance coded into light strips and audible pulses. Yet the station remained eerily quiet, as if the systems themselves had been denied the right to dramatize what was happening. Or perhaps as if someone on site preferred silence. The archivist leaned close enough that only I could hear him. This is consistent. With what? With every surviving review, he said. The same pattern. Calm communications. Immediate local superiority. Minimal spectacle. Their objective is not fear. What is it? He looked at the black public screen. Return. That word settled into me deeper than any military term could have. Because conquest expands. Punishment displays. Revenge lingers. Return narrows. Return does not care about prestige. It does not need witnesses. It does not want the stage. It wants the thing taken, restored to its own. Everything else matters only in relation to that completion. A sharp tone cut through the annex. Not an alarm, a priority access request. My terminal again. A new window opened. This time it contained a station schematic. Sublevel sectors. Service corridors. Pressure gates. Maintenance shafts. Emergency lift trunks. Detention routing nodes. Security chambers. All of it. Not from me. For me. A single highlighted line pulsed through the map, beginning near a blind maintenance spine outside the public access grid and ending at sublevel 12 intake. At the bottom of the screen were 6 words. Confirm if non-combatants remain in red. I stared at the message so long that the letters began to blur. Around me, the annex staff were too busy watching public system failures to notice what sat open on my private screen. For one suspended second, I could not understand why the question had come to me. Then I understood with sick clarity. Because all day I had been one of the few people on Hearth Vale actually reading the files. Actually checking the transfer routes. Actually noticing what had been moved and where. Someone on site, or above us, or inside us, or threaded through systems I could barely imagine, had determined that the fastest path to avoiding unnecessary death was to ask the clerk who had been paying attention. Not a general. Not a counselor. Not a security chief. A recorder. My fingers hovered over the slate. Should I answer? The law said no. The law also said the 11 humans were still in valid protective detention. The law had said many things that day. I pulled up the sublevel transfer requests, cross-checked the latest corridor lock changes, and overlaid the unfinished emergency movement notices the wardens had been filing in half-suppressed panic since dusk cycle. 3 civilian maintenance workers were still tagged in red zone proximity near utility spine C. 2 medtechs had not signed out from a lower checkpoint. 1 station sanitation crew had been rerouted but never confirmed clear of Sector 12 access. 7 non-combatants. If the files were current. The files were honest. If no one had already died. The highlighted line on the map pulsed again. Confirm. I do not know whether what I did next was bravery, treason, or the first honest act of my career. I typed. 7 possible station civilians remain in red. Utility spine C and med checkpoint 2. Sanitation crew unconfirmed. For half a second nothing happened. Then the map updated. The route shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough to bend around the flagged zones, rerouting through a narrower pressure service corridor most station personnel did not even know existed. A final line appeared. Receive. Hold everyone above level 9. Then the window closed. My hands were shaking. The archivist had seen enough from the angle of my screen to understand. He did not ask what I had done. He only gave the smallest possible nod, not of approval exactly but of recognition, as if some ancient equation had just balanced itself in front of him. Across the annex, the public screen changed again. This time not to system error. To a live text relay. No source identified. No access chain displayed. Just transcript lines appearing in real time as if the station itself had been forced to witness. Sublevel response Team 3 to command. Visual contact negative. Corridor sealed from inside. Repeat, sealed from inside command to Team 3. Breach and secure response Team 3. Unable command. Clarify unable response Team 3. Door is open command. Then proceed response Team 3. Corridor beyond is not empty. The transcript stopped there. No one in the annex spoke. No one needed to. Every mind in that room was now supplying its own version of the unfinished line. A fresh vibration rolled through the floor, closer, sharper, followed by the unmistakable hiss of emergency pressure equalization somewhere beneath us. Then, at last, one alarm tried to begin. A single clipped pulse of warning tones sounded over the station speakers. It cut off mid-note. As if even panic required authorization now denied. Another private message appeared on my slate. No map this time. No instructions. Only a sentence. This is your last delay window. Then, before I could react, a second line followed beneath it. Open the chamber feed. I looked up. The main council chamber had been sealed for over an hour under emergency continuity rules. No clerk at my level could unlock its internal broadcast without direct approval from 3 senior offices, 2 of which were no longer responding and the third was likely still arguing that formal procedure had not yet been exhausted. But the request was not phrased as a plea. It was phrased like logistics. The humans did not need permission. They needed speed. I routed through the annex transcript backbone, forced a legacy relay bridge the chamber systems had forgotten to remove from public mediation infrastructure, and after 3 failed authentication loops the wall screen in front of us flickered alive. The council appeared. Disordered. Well, mid-argument. Councillor Marintal was standing now, one hand on the central desk, speaking too quickly to preserve dignity. An unlawful paramilitary intrusion into sovereign station space and I will not have this body coerced by. The chamber doors behind him slid open. Not explosively. Not dramatically. Quietly. 47 humans entered. No matching uniforms. No theatrical armor. No shouted commands. Just movement, controlled, efficient, dispersed with the ease of people who had already memorized the room before stepping into it. Some wore civilian jackets overplated under layers. Some looked like dock workers until one noticed the way they scanned exits before faces. One carried a compact medical case. Another held nothing visible at all. Their leader, if he was their leader, stood near the center aisle with the stillness of a man for whom every second had already been budgeted. The council froze. Marintal stopped speaking, though his mouth remained slightly open as if the rest of his sentence had lost confidence before leaving him. One of the humans raised a hand, not threateningly, merely to mark attention, and said in a voice so calm it forced the entire chamber to hear every syllable. "We have your people clear on the lower route." No one moved. The human continued. "You have 7 station civilians still alive because we adjusted for them." His eyes moved across the chamber, not searching, not hesitating, simply locating. "Now you will release full access to Dock Spine East, stand down all interception protocols, and remain seated while medical transit completes." Marintal found his voice first. "You cannot enter this chamber and issue commands." The human turned his head slightly toward him. And then he said the line the station would remember long after every official record had been edited into cowardice. "We are not here to command you. We are here because you delayed. Nothing in my life, not the archive, not the warnings, not the old precedent, not the trembling floors, struck me as hard as the lack of emotion in that sentence. No fury. No triumph. No cruelty. Only consequence." Behind me, somewhere in the annex, someone whispered, "Oh." It was such a small sound. Barely language. But it carried the shape of the whole day. Because at last everyone understood. The humans had not arrived angry. They had arrived finished with waiting. And Hearth Vale, with all its seals, councils, patrols, phrases, classifications, and beautiful procedural lies, had finally heard the cold truth from the mouths of the people it had mistaken for negotiators. This had never been pending. It had only been delayed. Later, the official report would claim the operation inside Hearth Vale lasted 14 minutes. That was technically true. It was also a lie. Because operation implies a beginning the station recognized. What happened in those 14 minutes had begun much earlier, when the first comm message arrived, when the first route was measured, when the first lock request turned into fear, when Article 0 clawed its way back into the light, when 11 ordinary civilians became the only fact that mattered. But if you mean the visible part, the part the cameras failed to bury and the committees failed to rename, then yes. 14 minutes. That was how long it took for Hearth Vale to learn the difference between security and interruption. The 47 humans in the chamber did not spread chaos. They spread certainty. That is harder to fight. Chaos invites reaction. Certainty makes reaction feel late. On the chamber feed, the one I had reopened through a relay path no one remembered still existed. The lead human stood in the center aisle while the others moved with quiet division of purpose. 2 took the west doors. 1 checked the chamber's comm spine and severed a hidden uplink without even looking at the panel for more than a second. 3 more moved toward the medical alcove where emergency trauma units were stored, not because anyone in the chamber was hurt, but because someone below would be. None of them rushed. That unnerved me more than speed would have. Fast movement looks like effort. Measured movement looks like ownership. Counselor Marin Tal tried again, because men who mistake office for mass often believe the world will remember their title even after force has stopped caring. This is a sovereign deliberative body, he said, voice straining now under the weight of reality. You have no recognized authority in this chamber. The human closest to him did not even glance his way. Instead, a woman near the rear dais, mid-height, dark transit jacket, one sleeve cut shorter to accommodate some old scar contracture along the wrist, answered while checking a tactical slate against the room's wall lighting grid. Correct. Marin Tal blinked, caught off balance by agreement. She continued. We are operating under recovery authority. The phrase hit the chamber like a dropped blade. Recovery authority. Not military necessity. Not retaliation. Not intervention. Recovery. Again that narrowing word. That terrible discipline narrowing. It reduced the galaxy's favorite abstractions, jurisdiction, sovereignty, optics, strategic posture, to their true size in the presence of people trying to get their own back alive. On screen, one of the block delegates half rose from his chair as if to object, then saw something off camera and sat down so quickly the motion became nearly comic. For years afterward I would wonder what he had seen. A weapon? A stare? Merely the complete absence of uncertainty in the humans around him? Fear often needs very little once it has context. Below the chamber transcript, a secondary station relay had begun dumping fragmented sublevel updates onto the public channel, perhaps because whatever held the lower systems now no longer cared to preserve elegant compartmentalization. Sublevel 12 med intake breach detainee corridor unsecured response team 2 status unknown pressure gate C open medical transfer requested at dock spine east override accepted. The last line produced visible confusion among the counselors. Accepted by whom? No one in the chamber asked that aloud. Because by then they already knew the answer would only humiliate them further. The archivist had moved beside my desk without my noticing. He watched the feed with his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that the knuckles showed white through the skin. They're already out, he murmured. How do you know? Look at the team. I did. The chamber humans were not tense in the way assault units are tense when the objective is still unresolved. They were alert, yes. Exacting. Ready. But not searching. That was when I realized the chamber was not the rescue. It was the administrative end of the rescue. The hostage work had already been done below. What we were watching now was containment of interference. That changed everything. Because it meant the impossible part had occurred off-screen, and the people now standing under the council lights were those assigned to make sure no one above ruined the clean exit below. My mind raced backward through the afternoon. The rerouted map, the vanished signatures, the corridor lock failures, the transcript line, corridor beyond is not empty, the order for response teams to stand down. The humans had not entered the chamber first. They had entered the station first. And by the time the council saw them, the station had already been solved. A new text relay line flashed. Lower Med confirms 11 located, 3 ambulatory, 5 stabilized, 2 critical but viable, 1 surgical priority. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath. 11 located. Not 10. Not bodies counted. Located. The relief that went through the annex was so sharp it bordered on pain, even among people who had no right to feel relieved after helping build the machine that caused the need for rescue in the first place. Clerk Saren sat down suddenly and covered his face with both hands. My supervisor whispered, "All alive," like a man reciting a miracle he did not deserve to witness. The archivist did not react. Or rather, he reacted only by closing his eyes once and reopening them. "Not all right," he said quietly, "but alive." On the chamber feed, Marental had finally understood that rhetoric no longer had weight here. He switched, as frightened officials always do, from indignation to procedural compromise. "If your personnel below have recovered the detainees," he said carefully, "then this body is prepared to discuss safe transfer terms." A soft sound escaped one of the humans near the east wall. Not laughter. Something more cutting than laughter. Pity, perhaps. The lead human turned fully toward Tal for the first time. "No," he said. The word was calm enough to stop the room cold. "No transfer terms. No joint language. No staged handoff. Medical transit is underway. You will not obstruct it, and afterward you will answer for delay." There it was again, that refusal to inflate itself into drama. No threats of conquest. No grand moral speech. Just sequence. First our people. Then your consequences. Tal's face darkened with a last reflex of authority. "You presume far too much from a tactical trespass." For the first time since entering the chamber, the lead human's expression changed. Not into rage. Into something far more unnerving. Recognition. The same look I had seen on the restrained crewman in the detention image hours earlier. The look of someone who understood exactly what kind of person stood before him and had already placed him in the proper category. "Tactical?" the human repeated. He inclined his head slightly, as though considering whether Tal deserved correction. "What happened below was medical retrieval through unlawful detention infrastructure while avoiding your civilians where possible." He paused. "This chamber is paperwork." The silence that followed was one of the purest sounds I have ever heard. Not because it was empty. Because it was true. Everything Hearth Vale had done that day, every classification, every procedural shield, every delayed motion, every polished lie, was suddenly exposed for what it had always been. Not power. Paperwork. Paperwork backed by doors. Paperwork backed by frightened men with authorizations. Paperwork backed by the expectation that no one would dare treat the machinery itself as temporary. But the humans had. And now one sentence had reduced the station's whole moral architecture to stationary. The live lower relay updated again. Dock Spine East sealed for Med Transit unmarked shuttle receiving station personnel cleared from corridor. No additional casualties confirmed. No additional casualties. That line mattered. It mattered more than some in the annex understood. Because it told us what kind of operation this was. Not massacre. Not blood debt. Surgical. The station had expected rage. What it got was triage. I think that was when the full myth took root in me, not because the humans were unstoppable but because they were selective. Because even after delay, even after detention, even after injury, even after forcing entry through a fortified station, their effort remained painfully, almost insultingly focused. Get the 11. Keep the bystanders alive. Prevent interference. No speeches for the cameras. No symbolic executions. No humiliation rituals. Just completion. The chamber doors opened a second time. 2 more humans entered with a gravlift stretcher between them, moving at the brisk, controlled pace of people who know every wasted second echoes in tissue and blood. A medic walked alongside, one hand steady on the field stabilizer. For only a moment the stretcher crossed the chamber camera's angle, but that moment was enough. One of the 11 lay there. Conscious barely. Face bloodless. Neck braced. Right arm immobilized in emergency seal foam. A transport mask over the mouth and nose. The chamber saw what its argument had become. Not precedent. Not leverage. Not managed detention. A wounded civilian. Marental visibly recoiled. Good, I thought. Good. Let him see one face. Let at least one of them see what their language had done to an actual body. The medic did not slow. The team carrying the stretcher did not look at the counselors. They crossed the chamber because the chamber happened to be the fastest clean route to Dock Spine East after the West Transit Spine had been compromised. That too was humiliating. The great deliberative center of Hearth Vale had become a hallway in someone else's rescue plan. As the stretcher passed, the injured human on it turned their head a fraction. Just enough to look at the chamber. At the council. At Marental. No hatred showed there. Only exhaustion. That was worse. Hatred can be argued with. It proves emotional entanglement. Exhaustion says you are not important enough to hate. You are only one more obstacle between pain and home. The stretcher vanished out the far door. A final sublevel note hit the relay. Last detainee in transit recovery package complete. Complete. The word from Article 0 again. My skin prickled. Beside me the archivist whispered, "That's it." "It can't be," I said. "That fast." He gave the faintest shake of his head. "You're still imagining the station as the main character." I looked back to the feed. He was right. Everything about Hearth Vale, its gates, patrols, policies, chamber architecture, command language, had encouraged us to think in station time. To assume any response must unfold at the pace of our systems. But the humans had never entered that clock. They had used it, mapped it, bypassed it, and reduced it to background conditions. The 47 had not beaten Hearth Vale in a battle. They had treated it like weather. On the chamber screen, one of the humans by the east doors touched 2 fingers to an earpiece and said, "Package clear." The lead human nodded once. Then he addressed the council for what would be the last time. "You had repeated notice," he said. "You were given identification, time, and opportunity. You chose delay. Preserve your records. You will need them. Not we will destroy you. Not this means war. Not you will regret this. Preserve your records." As if their real enemy was no longer armed resistance but the coming temptation to lie. And perhaps it was. Because power survives many defeats. It struggles most with accurate memory. The team began to withdraw in pieces, never presenting one vulnerable cluster, never turning their backs carelessly. Each movement dovetailed with the others so seamlessly that I found myself understanding why old civilizations wrote warnings instead of military analyses. There are operations one can study tactically and operations that become myth because their precision exceeds the vocabulary of ordinary fear. On the public relay, the final docking notice appeared. Unmarked shuttle departed dock spine east exit vector acquired no station intercept active. And that was it. No triumphant music. No final threat. No collapsing empire. Just an outbound craft carrying 11 battered civilians away from the people who had mistaken custody for control. The chamber remained frozen even after the last human left. Counselor Marentau was still standing, but whatever shape of authority had once animated him now looked detached from his body, like a costume waiting to be removed. Around him, delegates stared at one another with the dawning awareness that the event they would spend the next 20 years trying to phrase had already chosen its permanent meaning without them. The archivist's voice came from beside me, low and grim. "Now comes the second half." I tore my eyes from the screen. "There's more?" He looked not frightened now, but tired in the way survivors look tired when they know history has finished the visible part and is about to begin the lasting one. "The recovery is over," he said. "Now the station learns what that cost it." I looked back at the feed, at the empty doorway through which the last stretcher had vanished, at the chamber where official power still stood upright without understanding it had already become testimony. In 14 minutes, Hearth Vale had failed as captor, failed as authority, failed as narrator of its own actions. And the most terrifying part was not that the humans had come in force. It was that they had come in limits. Only 47. Only what was necessary. Only until the 11 were back in motion toward home. That was the true demonstration. Not destruction. Control so complete it never needed to become excess. And somewhere inside that realization, deeper than awe and sharper than fear, the whole station finally understood what Article 0 had been trying to say for centuries. The danger was never that humans would do anything. The danger was that once they came for their own, they would know exactly how much was enough. For almost 30 seconds after the last human left the chamber, no one spoke. That silence mattered. Not because silence is dramatic. Because institutions hate it. Councils are built to metabolize reality into language. Resolutions, objections, clarifications, procedural suspensions. Anything so long as events can be turned back into process quickly enough that the room still feels sovereign over them. Silence is what remains when process arrives too late and language has not yet found a dignified lie. Hearth Vale sat in that silence like a condemned thing awaiting its own explanation. On the chamber feed, Counselor Marentau was still standing beside the central desk, but the stance no longer suggested command. It suggested a man who had forgotten how to sit after being made irrelevant in public. Around him, block delegates looked not at one another but at their terminals, at the black doors, at the chamber lights, at anything except the obvious fact that had just unfolded in front of them. A sovereign station had unlawfully detained 11 civilians, ignored repeated warnings, failed to protect its own infrastructure, and then watched a foreign retrieval team enter its political center and use the council chamber as a transit corridor for the wounded. No vote could survive that untouched. The first to break was not Tao. It was Delegate Orenve of the Fifth Compact, a soft-voiced trade proceduralist whose entire career had been built on never being the first to say anything that might later need defending. He rose with visible hesitation and asked the kind of question weak men use when stronger questions would implicate them more directly. "Do we have confirmation," he said, "that the detained individuals are no longer under station authority?" No one answered him. Because everyone knew the question was obscene. As though authority still existed in the abstract once the people had already been taken back in the concrete. Tal found enough of himself to reply. "This body has not recognized the legitimacy of any so-called recovery authority," he said. "We are presently assessing an armed incursion into protected governance space." The words sounded dead even before he finished them. Not wrong in structure. Worse. Unbelieved. Across the annex, Clerk Saren made a small choking noise that might have been a laugh if laughter and despair shared the same wound. My supervisor looked as though he wanted to disappear into the wall behind him. The archivist, standing rigid beside my desk, did not react at all. He had likely seen too many powerful men try to recover dignity by speaking in the tense of a world that no longer existed. Then the chamber doors opened again. No human team this time. Medical officers. 3 station medics and 1 human physician walking beside a graph stretcher loaded with field cases, transit blood packs and portable life support modules. They did not stop in the chamber center. They did not address the council. They crossed from west access to east exit in the same ruthless economy the retrieval team had used minutes earlier. But the human physician paused just once. Only once. Near the center aisle. Long enough to look at the assembled delegates. Long enough to ensure every camera still functioning captured the moment. Then she said, in the controlled tone of a doctor explaining something obvious to people who should already have known it. 3 of the 11 would have died if you had delayed another hour. No one replied. She did not wait for one. She kept walking. The sentence struck harder than any accusation made all day because it converted the chamber's favorite refuge, delay, into a measurable body count. Another hour. Not theory. Not rhetoric. Not future consequence. Another hour. And 3 more deaths. That was the moment the room changed. You could see it happen. Not morally. Institutions do not become moral on command. But structurally. The delegates began, one by one, to realize they were no longer deciding how to frame an incident. They were deciding whether they wished their names attached to its preservation. Delegate Vey sat down. 2 block representatives opened side-channel discussions simultaneously. One of the legal advisors whispered urgently into a private slate and then, after reading the answer that came back, turned visibly pale. Something was moving beyond the room now. Beyond Hearth Vale. Beyond station command. The galaxy had begun to watch. The first public feeds restored at 2103 station cycle. Not because the council ordered it. Because it could no longer prevent it. Partial footage from corridor cameras. Transcripts from lower response teams. Docking notices. Medroute clearances. The black screen notice announcing containment loss. Chamber footage clipped and recirculated before internal sensors could fully scrub it. No single file showed everything. But together they showed enough. Enough for the trade worlds. Enough for the military blocks. Enough for the neutral systems that usually preferred not to notice who disappeared on the edges of procedure. Enough for shame. Within 7 minutes, formal inquiry requests began arriving from 6 external jurisdictions. Within 12, station insurers demanded an immediate incident classification revision. Within 19, Hearth Vale's own transit partners temporarily suspended privileged arbitration status pending review of unlawful civilian detention conduct. The station had not yet finished arguing about sovereignty. The market had already voted. That is another thing bureaucracies forget. Legitimacy is not only legal. It is logistical. Once enough people stop trusting your corridors, your signatures, your guarantees, your careful language becomes decoration. On the chamber feed, Tal was still trying to build a wall out of terminology. Any discussion of this matter must begin, he said, voice tight now, with the armed violation committed by off-world personnel acting outside recognized treaty processes. No, said another voice. It came from the rear tier. Senior ethics assessor Lynn Sereth had not spoken once during the entire day. Most people forgot she was even present during major council motions because her office existed mainly to issue advisory objections no one important read unless a scandal forced retrospective interest. She was old, severe, and famous only among clerks for attaching unervingly precise moral annotations to otherwise dry procedural documents. She stood now with one hand resting lightly on the bench before her, as if rising required no effort at all. No, she repeated. Any honest discussion must begin with the seizure. The chamber went still. Sereth continued before Tal could interrupt. 11 civilians under protected passage were taken without lawful charge, denied immediate access, reclassified through unsupported threat language, physically transferred into detention infrastructure, and held through repeated external notice. Every delay after first acknowledgement compounded liability. Every motion to preserve appearance over release increased harm. There it was. At last. Not outrage. Record. The cleanest form of destruction available to civilized people. Tal straightened, stung less by contradiction than by the fact that the contradiction was competent. You are out of order. Sareth turned her head toward him with the stillness of a blade deciding whether effort is necessary. No, she said. Order is what you have damaged. I felt the archivist beside me exhale very slowly. He knew, as I knew, that the chamber had finally produced the one thing the day had been missing. An internal voice willing to name the crime before outsiders named it for them. Sareth requested immediate floor recognition. For once no one denied it. Perhaps because the chamber sensed instinctively that denial now would only deepen the ruin. Perhaps because some of them still hoped a precise enough condemnation might reduce the size of what was coming. They were wrong, but the instinct itself was understandable. She stepped into the speaking line and activated no projection aids. No data columns. No legal graphs. No decorative charts of jurisdictional history. Just her voice, carried cleanly by chamber acoustics designed for authority. I am entering emergency ethical review into record, she said. And I am requesting full preservation of all files associated with detention authorization, route transfer, med delay requests, species classification amendments, and advisory motions introduced after initial human contact. She let the list settle. Then, this is not a sovereignty question. No one breathed. This is not an incursion question. Silence held. This is a custody question. And every species in this chamber knows the difference. The words moved through the room with the cold force of inevitability. Because that was the truth Tal and the others had spent all day trying to bury beneath procedural fog. If the event could be reframed as military violation, then Hearth Vale remained a victim of excessive response. But if it remained what it actually was, a custody event, an unlawful taking, then everything changed. Custody events are personal. And personal crimes strip abstract power of its camouflage. Sareth looked across the delegates one by one, forcing each to occupy their own face while she spoke. They warned us, she said. Repeatedly. They identified the detainees. They specified urgency. They offered return before force. We answered with process, not because process was necessary, but because delay preserved the vanity of those who preferred not to admit wrongdoing in time. Her eyes moved to Tal, though she did not name him. That vanity placed civilians into surgical priority. No one in the chamber could survive that sentence cleanly. Outside, the restored feeds were already fragmenting her speech into quoted lines. I could see them appearing in adjacent windows. Market boards, legal channels, public commentators, species analysts, independent relays, all pulling pieces into wider circulation faster than the council could possibly contain. This was how myth became public law. Not all at once. Through quotable truth. Tal made one final attempt. You are inviting panic. Sareth answered instantly. No. I am inviting memory. The archivist closed his eyes. Not from grief. From recognition. For the second time that day, some old line from buried history had returned wearing a living face. The chamber no longer belonged to the people who had governed it. It belonged to the person willing to say what the record would later need. Sareth requested that Article 0 be entered into emergency discussion under recurrence conditions. The phrase detonated across the room. Several delegates reacted before they could stop themselves. One actually muttered no into an open chamber mic, and the sound carried through the feed with humiliating clarity. Another reached for a mute key too late. Tal's face changed in a way that told me he knew the phrase, if only by rumor. So the old warning had not been as forgotten as everyone pretended. Only avoided. Denied, Tal said sharply. That article is not in active civic use. Because previous powers found it embarrassing, Sareth replied. Not because it ceased to be relevant. She turned toward the recording core. Enter this into chamber record. Buried caution is not invalid caution. Then she did what no one else that day had possessed the courage to do. She read from memory. Not the whole article. Not the sealed case lines. Only the standing guidance that mattered. If separation has occurred, reverse it immediately. Delay increases response scope. Return the taken intact. Return them fast. Hearing those words aloud in the chamber did something that arguments had failed to do. It placed Hearth Vale in a lineage. Not of rulers. Of repeat offenders. The delegates knew it. You could see it in the way some of them suddenly became very interested in future phrasing, in private counsel, in how quickly they might distance themselves from motions they had supported only an hour before. Political courage is rare. Political evacuation is common. The motions began almost at once. Suspend Marin Tal's floor authority pending investigation. Freeze all detention policy revisions made in the last 12 hours. Open independent review into species threat reclassification procedures. Preserve and export chamber records under intersystem observation. Request formal contact with Earth for medical status confirmation and post-incident accounting. None of it was noble. Most of it was late. All of it was proof that power had changed direction. Tal objected, of course. He objected to process, to sequence, to legitimacy, to panic, to precedent, to the outrageous impropriety of revising internal confidence during external coercion. But each objection sounded weaker than the last because the room no longer needed him to be right. It only needed him to be containable. By the time the vote was called to suspend his procedural authority, the outcome was obvious. Not unanimous. Worse. Fast. He lost the chamber in less than 30 seconds. That, more than the rescue team, more than the broken sublevels, more than the public exposure, made the day feel truly irreversible to me. Because once a council turns on one of its own that quickly, it is not seeking justice. It is seeking survivability. And survivability means the institution has accepted the event is real. The vote closed. Tao remained standing a moment too long, as if some hidden structure might still carry him if he simply refused to sit. Then, slowly he lowered himself into his chair. He looked older. Smaller. For the first time all day he resembled what he actually was. Not the embodiment of law. Just a man who had delayed 11 people too long. Sarah did not celebrate. She did not soften. She requested immediate dispatch of a station-wide advisory reclassifying the event from detention dispute to unlawful civilian seizure pending full review. When one of the legal clerks hesitated over the phrasing, she added, "Use the plain words. We have exhausted the decorative ones." I felt something like gratitude then. Not for her, exactly. Gratitude was too warm and the day had gone too cold. But for the existence of one person inside the machine who still understood that truth spoken late is better than falsehood spoken quickly. Outside the chamber, public commentary had already moved beyond shock. Now came interpretation. Old commentators resurfaced fragments of archived warnings once dismissed as legend. Military analysts discussed why only 47 had been needed. Ethical boards debated whether Article 0 itself should have remained sealed. Trade worlds began freezing discretionary custody clauses in mixed-species ports. Insurance consortia flagged human protected persons as a new catastrophic liability category. The galaxy was doing what the galaxy always does after surviving humiliation. Standardizing it. That, more than speeches, told me the story had escaped Hearth Vale forever. It was no longer our scandal. It was everyone's lesson. Sareth delivered one final statement before the chamber recessed. "Let the record show," she said, "that the greatest error committed here was not force. It was interpretation. We believed custody would remain administrative. We believed delay would preserve authority. We believed naming the detainees as a policy matter would reduce the personal reality of what was done to them." She paused, and in the pause the whole station seemed to lean toward her. We were wrong. And because we were wrong, others came to do for us what we had refused to do for ourselves. Return the taken. No flourish followed. None was needed. The chamber recessed into emergency review. The public feeds kept running. And across Hearth Vale, from the high councils to the freight rings to the maintenance shafts where workers would be repeating the story before dawn cycle, one truth settled with irreversible weight over everything that had happened. The rescue was not the end of the event. The confession was. Because until the station admitted what it had done, this could still have been argued into misunderstanding. Now it could not. Now there was record. Now there was language sharp enough to hold memory in place. And somewhere out beyond the ring, 11 wounded civilians were being carried farther from Hearth Vale with every passing second, while the station they left behind finally began the more painful operation, learning how to describe itself honestly after being seen. For the rest of the night, Hearth Vale talked in numbers. 11 recovered. 3 nearly lost. 47 on site. 14 minutes visible. 0 station intercepts. Dozens of failed overrides. Hundreds of public relay copies escaping suppression every minute. By dawn cycle, analysts had already begun shaping the event into categories. Recovery doctrine. Cross-species liability. Custody escalation. Infrastructure breach response. Continuity failure risk. Trade repercussions. Insurance collapse scenarios. Emergency ethics reform. Article 0 recurrence law. The station wrapped itself in analysis the way the wounded wrap themselves in blankets. Less because it heals, more because it gives the body something to do while the shock continues. But for all the reports, all the chamber statements, all the furious legal revision, the thing I remember most clearly from that night was not in any council feed. Was a name. I found it 6 hours after the shuttle departed. Not because anyone sent it to me. Because by then I could no longer stop reading. The annex had thinned into exhaustion. Some clerks had been dismissed. Others sat in place under emergency caffeine lamps, eyes red, uniforms wrinkled, hands moving automatically through preservation tasks they would not fully understand until later inquiries turned them into evidence custodians against their will. My supervisor had finally gone silent. Clerk Saren was asleep with his head on folded arms beside a still-running transcript terminal. The archivist had vanished without saying goodbye, perhaps because men like him understand exactly when a story no longer needs old witnesses and must instead be carried by younger ones who did not survive the first version. I should have left. Instead I opened the medtransfer logs. At first it was only because I needed confirmation the 11 had all made it off station alive. The lower relay had said recovery package complete, but phrases like that were built for process, not for conscience. I wanted the kind of certainty only names can give. The first 2 logs were heavily redacted. The third was not. Someone, human or station side, I never learned which, had attached a partial treatment summary to the emergency corridor transfer archive before the system locked it behind post-incident review. It listed 11 patients. 1 by 1. Stabilization condition. Transport class. Immediate risks. Consciousness markers. Priority notes. I read them slowly. I do not know why that mattered. Perhaps because names resist mythology. They drag grandeur back toward flesh. After a day like ours, after chamber speeches and old warnings and system failures and history reawakening in the bones of a station, there is a temptation to let the event become too large for ordinary people. To call it precedent. To call it doctrine. To call it a turning point, a species lesson, a civilizational correction. All of that was true. And none of it was the first truth. The first truth was that 11 people had been taken. The second was that they had names. The third log told me what Hearth Vale had done to one of them. Tomas Vallis, 34 standard years. Survey engineer. Civilian transit certification. Fractured ulna, hypoxic exposure, blunt force trauma, prolonged restraint injury, internal bleeding controlled in field. Conscious during transfer. Asked twice for crew count before accepting sedation. I stared at that last line so long the words lost shape. Asked twice for crew count before accepting sedation. Not where am I? Not are we safe? Not what happened to me. Crew count. That was the kind of detail no official speech would ever carry, and because it would not, it mattered more than speeches. I kept reading. Leanne Mercer, ship medic. 49 standard years. Cervical laceration, concussion, dehydration, soft tissue trauma. Refused pain suppressant until others were triaged. Nadia Agricultural Education Liaison. 28 standard years. Shock state, rib damage, minor oxygen deficit. Repeatedly requested confirmation that station-side civilians had been cleared from route sectors before transport. That line stopped me too. Not because it surprised me. Because by then it did not. Even wounded, even just retrieved from detention, they were still trying to account for people not their own. Or perhaps by human standards, anyone close enough to die in the same corridor had become their own for the purposes of the moment. Article 0 had used the phrase proximity assigned responsibility. I understood it better now. Then I reached the 9th name. And everything changed shape. Elias Ward, 22 standard years. Junior systems technician. Acute thoracic injury, oxygen starvation, secondary cardiac instability, restraint trauma. Entered surgical priority during extraction. Prognosis uncertain at departure. 22. Junior systems technician. A child, by the standards of every chamber elder who had spent the day defending delay with polished voices and expensive language. I opened the attached transfer notation. Only 2 lines survived outside the medical shorthand. Patient remained conscious during lower route movement. Asked whether all 11 were leaving. I leaned back from the terminal and covered my mouth with my hand. That was the moment the whole event stopped being grand. Or rather, it remained grand, but the grandeur cracked open and the thing inside it was grief. All day Hearth Vale had been speaking about the humans as if they were principle made flesh, relentless, disciplined, historically dangerous, impossible to bargain with once obligation had been triggered. And maybe that was true. Maybe that was what civilization saw from the outside. But on a medlog written in haste by people trying to keep blood inside a 22-year-old body long enough to get him home, the truth looked simpler. He only wanted to know if all 11 were leaving. Not whether the station had been punished. Not whether the council had fallen apart. Not whether history would remember. Whether all 11 were leaving. I thought of the line the archivist had quoted from the Davin collapse. We thought they wanted revenge. They only wanted them back. Now, staring at Elias Ward's treatment notation, I understood that line more completely than I had in the chamber. Recovery is terrifying from the outside because it looks larger than proportion. From the inside, it probably feels small enough to fit into one injured thought. Did everyone get out? I searched the updated outbound shuttle logs until I found the final departure medical sync. 10 confirmed stable. 1 in active surgery during transit. No fatalities at departure. Destination classified. No fatalities at departure. It should have relieved me. It did, but not cleanly. Because relief after such a sentence carries its own guilt. A whole station had spent the day wagering delay against bodies, and now I was grateful not for justice, not for truth, not even for the successful destruction of a lie, but for the fact that one 22-year-old technician had still been alive when the ship cleared our orbit. That is the humiliating power of specific human survival. It shrinks every ideology around it. At 4:12 dawn cycle, an external medical acknowledgement arrived through the same impossible routing chain the earlier human messages had used. The annex almost missed it because by then half the staff were too exhausted to trust anything that entered a terminal without recognizable clearance. I opened it because I had become, somehow, the clerk for impossible messages. The note contained no greeting, no ceremony, no accusation, just an update. All 11 are alive. 3 remain critical. No reply required. That was all. I read it once, then again, then a third time because part of me had become convinced the day itself could not end without taking at least one final payment in blood. All 11 are alive. Across the annex, I heard someone begin crying softly. Not loudly. Not theatrically. The quiet crying of a person who has been holding their breath through history and only now remembers breathing was optional. I did not look to see who it was. Instead I looked back at the list of names. Tomas Valles, Ian Mercer, Nadia Ree, Elias Ward, and the rest. 11 names that Hearth Vale had tried to turn into custody categories, then leverage units, then procedural burdens, then public embarrassment. But they had remained stubbornly what they were at the start. People. That was why everything else had happened. Not because humans loved war. Not because they had ancient blood myths buried in their bones. Not because they secretly wanted occasions to demonstrate power in front of the galaxy. Because people had been taken. And because among humans, that fact appears to rearrange the hierarchy of all other concerns. Later commentaries would say the event changed trade law. That it reopened forbidden archives. That it altered station detention doctrine in 6 systems and insurance codes in 19 more. That it formally reintroduced Article 0 into restricted ethics training. That it destroyed Marintal's career and turned Lynn Sereth into an unwilling public conscience for a generation of frightened administrators. All true. But when I think back on Hearth Vale now, after the inquiries, after the speeches, after the rewritten charters and the public humiliations and the long years in which everyone pretended they had always known detention was impossible to justify once the first warning arrived, I do not first remember policy. I remember Elias Ward. 22. Chest full of failing air. Still conscious enough to ask if all 11 were leaving. That one line did more to explain humanity than every sealed article in the archive. Because it revealed the other side of the terror. From the outside, their retrieval looked mercilessly precise. From the inside, it was probably love under pressure. Not soft love. Not decorative love. The brutal kind. The logistical kind. The kind that counts names while bleeding. The kind that forces ships through darkness, reroutes around strangers to spare them, carries medkits into enemy chambers, and refuses to call the work finished until every living person is accounted for. That was what the galaxy kept getting wrong. It saw the aftermath and called humans dangerous. It saw the motive and should have called them bound. Toward dawn, I copied the 11 names onto a private slate of my own. Not because I had authority to preserve them. Because I no longer trusted authority to remember them correctly. Stations remember incidents. Councils remember votes. Empires remember embarrassments. Clerks remember names. And history, if it is lucky, is sometimes forced to borrow memory from clerks. I shut down my terminal only when the eastern viewport began to pale with Hearth Vale's false morning. The soft industrial light reflected off gray water and lower cloud banks. The kind of light that makes damaged places look clean from far enough away. The station was quieter by then. Not healed. A place can survive an event and still remain visibly altered by the knowledge of what it almost became. Hearth Vale had learned that in one night. Its corridors still stood. Its rings still turned. Its council still existed. Cargo would move again. Trade would resume. Systems would be patched. New procedures would be written. New officials would swear the right lessons had been learned. But under all of that, something permanent had shifted. Because now, whenever anyone on that station spoke too casually about custody, about delay, about protected detention, about soft leverage and temporary holds and manageable species pressure, there would be names beneath the language. 11 of them. And one of those names would always be 22 years old. 31 years later, people still asked me what frightened me most about that day. Age changes the question but not its hunger. When I was younger they asked about tactics. About how the humans entered Hearth Vale without triggering a visible station-wide breach response. How 47 personnel crossed a fortified detention architecture, extracted 11 civilians, preserved 7 unrelated station lives after rerouting around them, and still had enough control left to walk into a sovereign chamber and reduce a council to silence without firing the kind of shots history usually remembers. Later, when enough restricted files had become half public and enough embarrassed governments had rewritten enough policies to pretend they had always agreed with the final lesson, people changed their tone. They asked about doctrine. They asked whether Article 0 had truly deserved its old reputation, whether the Davin records were exaggerated, whether the phrase Human Recovery Authority had ever been formally recognized before Hearth Vale, or whether the event itself forced recognition into administrative language that had resisted it for centuries. And now, in age, they ask the most dangerous version of the question. They ask what humanity is. It is a foolish question but not an empty one. Civilizations are always trying to reduce one another to a sentence. The urge is understandable. We are frightened by what exceeds neat description, and species that survive long enough begin mistaking categories for knowledge. So they ask for one truth, one phrase, one final reduction that can be taught in academies and entered into advisory memos and repeated by people who were not there. What are humans? I have learned not to answer quickly. Quick answers are for people who were absent. I was there when the warning returned. I was there when the station still believed words like containment and review and discretionary authority could hold a crime still long enough to make it manageable. I was there when 11 civilians were turned into a procedural object. I was there when old embarrassment became present terror, when buried history crawled back into relevance because a council thought delay was stronger than obligation. I was there when the first comm messages arrived and the room laughed. I was there when it stopped laughing. I was there when the chamber saw one wounded body cross its polished floor and realized too late that the great event of the day had never been sovereignty or retaliation or military balance. It had been custody. I remember the station as it looked the morning after. Nothing dramatic. That is important. Hearth Vale had not been burned out of orbit. Its oceans remained beneath it, gray and patient. Dock traffic resumed in partial lanes. Maintenance crews patched the lower routes. Emergency med units restocked. Chamber personnel changed shifts. Merchants argued about losses. Analysts filled public feeds with the usual post-humiliation industry of explanation. Even Marin Tao, suspended and later indicted, still existed for a while as a man walking through halls that no longer respected his shadow. The station survived. That too was part of the lesson. Because lesser storytellers would have preferred a cleaner ending. Fire. Ruin. Annihilation obvious enough to flatter the moral imagination. But history rarely arranges itself for dramatic simplicity and humanity. This was the truth the galaxy spent too long refusing to face. Did not come to Hearth Vale to create legend from ash. They came for 11 people. Once the 11 were in motion home, the rest became accounting. That is why the event endured. Not because it displayed unbounded force. Because it displayed bounded force with terrifying clarity. Every species understands rage. Rage is common. Rage is noisy. Rage burns wider than intention and often destroys its own meaning in the process. Even cruelty in its vulgar forms is easy to understand. It loves theater. It leaves signatures. It mistakes visibility for power. What frightened the old powers, and still frightens the honest ones now, was that humanity looked nothing like that when it moved for its own. It became narrower, colder, more exact. As if attachment, once violated, did not produce madness but focus. The restricted reviews written after Hearth Vale eventually found their way into ethics instruction, command advisories, interspecies treaty appendices, and the insurance language of worlds far wiser than ours. I have read most of them. Some are clever. A few are honest. Nearly all are too long. Bureaucracies always answer humiliation by producing paperwork heavy enough to resemble wisdom. But every truly useful summary still circles the same center. The humans were not the strongest species in known space. They were not the oldest, not the most numerous, not the most technologically elegant, not the most politically unified, not the most naturally suited to the vacuum-dark difference between worlds. What they were, what history had been trying to say in fragments for centuries, was this. They were a species in which responsibility could become stronger than self-interest. That is a dangerous thing. Dangerous in the way all deep loyalties are dangerous. A state may calculate cost. A market may calculate risk. A fleet may calculate odds. A species built, however imperfectly, around the reflex that the taken must be returned calculates differently. This is where outsiders usually misunderstand me. They hear praise where I mean warning. I do not romanticize humanity. I watched the lower route recordings eventually. Not all of them survived review, but enough did. Enough to know the work below the station had not been soft. Enough to know the 47 carried scars before they ever reached us and likely acquired more after leaving. Enough to know that the body's Hearth Vale returned to orbit. Alive, yes, all 11 alive, as the impossible message later confirmed, would not all have remained unchanged by what happened in the dark beneath our ring. I also know the station officers who stood in those corridors encountered not abstract justice but its physical instruments. Broken route control. Disabled weapons. Precise incapacitation. Fear inserted into systems that had relied too long on the assumption that no one would move faster than procedure. Human recovery is not gentle. It is simply selective. That difference matters more than most civilizations are prepared to admit. Because selective force implies hierarchy of purpose. It implies there are things the humans will spare, things they will bypass, things they will preserve even under pressure, and things they will remove without hesitation when those things stand between them and the return of their own. It implies thought under stress, memory under violence, limits that remain limits even when they are no longer convenient. That is not moral innocence. It is something more consequential. Control in the service of obligation. The galaxy mistrusted Article 0 for generations because it sounded primitive when reduced to rumor. Do not touch humans. Do not take them alive. Do not separate them from what they claim. The phrases circulated in academies and barracks like folk curses stripped of explanatory dignity, and so the arrogant continued to mistake them for superstition. But the article had never been primitive. It had been concise. There is a difference. Concise warnings offend sophisticated people because they imply the lesson is simple enough to fit into one sentence and therefore embarrassing enough to have been avoidable. Sophisticated powers prefer complicated disasters. Complication preserves self-respect. If the chain of failure is long enough, any one actor can hide inside it and call the outcome tragic instead of chosen. Hearth Vale destroyed that refuge. Because the event, when stripped of all language that came later to soften it, was painfully simple. 11 people were taken. They were told to wait. The waiting ended. The 11 were returned. The station that delayed them was forced to remember itself honestly. Everything else was commentary. And so, when they ask me now what humanity is, I tell them a story instead of giving them a theory. I tell them about Tomas Valles, who asked for crew count before sedation. About Leanne Mercer refusing pain suppressant until others were triaged. About Nadia Ree wanting station civilians cleared from the route even while injured. About Elias Ward, 22 years old and barely holding consciousness inside a failing body, asking only whether all 11 were leaving. That is the answer. Not because 4 names can define a species. Because those names reveal the current that runs underneath the rest. From the outside, the humans on Hearth Vale looked like disciplined threat. From the inside, they were behaving in exact proportion to a belief so deeply held it had become operational instinct. No one gets left behind if movement is still possible. Other species have versions of that sentiment. Of course they do. We all speak beautifully about loyalty in peacetime. We all build memorials to solidarity after the cost has been paid by others. But humanity, for reasons I still suspect they themselves do not fully understand, made the sentiment logistical, portable, immediate, actionable under pressure. They do not merely admire the idea. They organize around it. And that is why stations like ours fail when they mistake human attachment for symbolic noise. Because what we called emotion they had already built into process. What we called outrage they had already translated into route maps. What we called a political incident they had already reduced to an answerable question. Who is still between the taken and their return? That question, once activated, is ruinous to anyone relying on delay as defense. I have outlived many of the officials who sat in the chamber that night. Some retired in disgrace. Some rebuilt themselves elsewhere under softer titles. Some spent the rest of their careers insisting their error had been procedural, not moral, which is the preferred lie of people who still hope history will confuse etiquette with ethics. Lynn Sereth died 10 years after the inquiries closed, with more citations to her post-Hearth Vale ethics address than to all her earlier work combined. The archivist vanished from public service not long after the Article 0 hearings and, if rumor is true, died relieved that the warning no longer depended on embarrassed old men keeping it half alive in dark files no one wanted to read. As for me, I became exactly what that day required. A keeper of sequence. Not a hero. Not a victim. Not even a proper historian by training. Only a clerk who was present when paperwork failed to contain truth. That is enough. It is enough because memory, if kept accurately long enough, eventually becomes culture. And culture, repeated carefully enough, becomes reflex. Somewhere now, in stations wiser than ours, young officers are being taught the lesson without laughter. Somewhere, custody clauses are written with names in mind instead of categories. Somewhere, a frightened official about to suggest delay is being interrupted by someone older, paler, and more honest who remembers Hearth Vale and says the only useful thing in time. Return them now. That is the real legacy of the day. Not fear of human vengeance. Fear is crude, and while crude tools work for a while, they do not instruct well across generations. The true legacy was precision. The recognition that there exists in humanity a form of commitment so concentrated that once crossed, it strips away everything ornamental and demands the world answer only for what matters. Return the taken. Account for the missing. Protect the route home. Finish the necessary work. Stop when they are back. It is almost unbearably simple. Which is why civilizations keep failing it. There are students who still press me for a final line, a sentence compact enough to carry away and repeat as if it were wisdom they discovered themselves. They want something memorable. Something sharp. Something old enough to sound inevitable and simple enough to survive being copied into training material by people who think elegance and truth are natural allies. Usually I refuse them. But age makes indulgence easier. So sometimes, only sometimes, I tell them this. The galaxy's oldest mistake was believing humans were most dangerous when they were angry. They are not. They are most dangerous when someone they love is missing, and they have finally stopped asking. And if the student is quiet enough after that, if they seem capable of understanding the part beneath the warning rather than merely enjoying the chill of it, I tell them the truest version. Not the one chambers repeat. Not the one war colleges polish. Not the one frightened officials quote when they want younger staff to obey faster than fear alone can persuade them. The truest version. I tell them what Hearth Vale taught me. Humans are not terrifying because they want revenge. They are terrifying because they want you back. And once you understand that all the old forbidden lines, all the sealed articles, all the embarrassed civilizations and vanished powers and rewritten compacts and trembling councils resolve into the only sentence history was ever trying to preserve. Do not stand between humans and their own.